Actually, not everything in the world is designed well or right, which is why some things seem funky. But the ones that do, you don't really think about it too much. Like you just use it and it feels right. It's very intuitive.
All right. Hey, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Craft Podcast. And today I have a special guest, Christie Tang, who is a product designer at Meta. I first met Christie, I don't even know, 7 or 8 years ago when we worked together at our esports startup, Ember. How are you doing today, Christie?
I'm doing good. I'm really happy to be here. It's been a long time coming since the last time we met, or for the
Yeah,
first time we met. Yeah, huge story there actually.
exactly. So, first question is, what is your craft?
My craft is product design. I've been working as a product designer for the last 6 years. I currently work at Meta as a product designer. And didn't actually start as a product designer. I studied psychology and I wanted to be a UX researcher, but it definitely helped me into my path today.
I want to talk about that as well because I feel like my next question is like, what is this broader design discipline? Because sometimes I hear like UX, like research, it could be part of like a research team, it could be part of design. Can you lay out, what is like the broader design function? Could be at multiple companies, could be at Meta. Just what have you seen out there?
So this is actually is a complicated answer in my opinion. Design is so much more than just like what you can see on a screen. Like at the base of it, design is anything that you can any experience, like not just like what you can see and feel, but also just like everything. Everything has been thought of by somebody. Like the doorknob that you touch, the placement of your walls on your floor, the walls in your room and the floors on your ground. Everything has been thought of by somebody. It was tasked by somebody to do this. And that in itself is a design, a choice that has been deliberately made. When it comes to screens though, it's a lot more than that. It's going to be like what's going to be good for the business, what's good for the developers, like what's easable and feasible, what the users want, what looks visually appealing. So it's going to be a combination of all those things that make a really good design.
That's such a great answer. I've thought about this topic a lot, and even today, someone asked me. They said, "Hey, how do you work with a designer?" For me, it's been different for each specific designer, much less like at each company. But I have never heard of an answer delivered that eloquently, frankly. So I really like that because the best designs, I can't even put a word to it. It just feels right. And it's like maybe it's like intentional, right? It's like someone has put thought into it. It's not just for people who haven't worked with designers, they just think like mock-ups or like
Hmm.
some like Miro or some other mood board or something, but it really is so much more.
Actually, not everything in the world is designed well or right, which is why some things seem funky. But the ones that do, you don't really think about it too much. Like you just use it and it feels right. It's very intuitive. But just small things like I'm looking at my Mac right now, and somebody chose to round the corners of this Mac. They chose to do like make these small micro decisions that nobody else would ever think about, but has a reason. There's a reason why anything was made the way they was.
That's so cool. Maybe let's focus on just like the product design part of kind of
Mm-hmm.
traditionally what we've seen at maybe like big tech firms. Talk more about that. Is that, what are the high level buckets of tasks or responsibilities product designers have at big tech firms?
So small plug, but I wrote this Medium article called "One of the Hardest Roles in Tech: Product Designer." The reason why I think it's so hard is because it's not just going to be the visuals. It's going to be, again, like talking to your developers, talking to the business stakeholders, understanding what the user needs are, combining with the user research. So it's very collaborative, it's very multifaceted. And I think the other hard part is you really have to be a seller at what you're doing. Even if you got all those things right, it doesn't matter if you can't sell it to the people. They have to understand it like from their point of view. So essentially you're like a juggling mediator. You're trying to find like the best answer that fulfills all these needs. And that's much more beyond than what is just what looks good on paper.
No, you bring up such a good point. I feel like, just based on this brief conversation so far, it sounds like being a good product designer can mean a variety of different things depending on what the team needs. In some ways, I feel like of all the roles, they are the most, they could contribute to like all the functions. Like generally
Hmm.
speaking, I feel like, if you're a marketer, there's certain things you're expected to do. If you're a product, there's certain things you're expected to do. If you're an engineer, it's even kind of even more defined. But you could add design elements to
Yes.
product engineering and marketing. And because it's kind of so nebulous and hard to nail down, it's such a difficult craft to like both execute on and understand how you fit into different roles just because the other people don't know how you fit in themselves. Like I actually didn't know that well until you just described it. I'm like, oh, okay, that makes perfect sense.
The hardest part is like it's required. It's part of the job that you have to do all of them. You can't just pick and choose. I'm gonna be good at like visual, I'm gonna be good at UX, but I'm not gonna really know how to do like the coding aspect. You have to know some coding to be a really successful designer. You don't have to code it, but you have to be able to understand like what's gonna be required. And that's how you know like whether something is feasible or not. And I think the part that's also really hard is like you have to have good presentation skills because ultimately you're selling the design. Like everybody can be swayed by something that they see. And it's like the saying of like everyone is a designer. It's like that, but pretty hardcore because as soon as you see something, you have a judgment. So when you make your presentations, you have to make sure that they didn't get clouded by the wrong judgments because they saw it first before they heard your explanation. And I think it's like it's tough in that sense. Like it's beyond more than just what the visuals and like the UX there. It's about the selling.
And we'll talk about the visuals and the UX too, because I do think that's like part of the core competencies. But I
Mhm.
do I do want to tie a little bit of what you just said to some of our one of our previous episodes. We covered mobile game producer slash product manager. And what's interesting is that our guest Owen, he said that part of a good game product manager or producer is systems design. And systems
Mhm.
design is actually something a game designer excels at, which is also, the different titles mean different things, right? They were specifically they have that title game designer. And I want to loop in another thing you just said, which is at least in the game industry, many game designers do have technical slash coding skills. So this is really fascinating. It's like there's some intersection here where my key takeaway now is that a good designer can really like serve as a glue for the team or can have just so much impact beyond once again I think a layman or sometimes you're joining a new team you're just like, oh, can I get like a mock-up of something. And I've behaved in that manner in the past as well. It's like, oh, I have an idea, can you just like do it for me? And I think that's like scratching the surface. I'm not utilizing the full skill set
Mhm.
of that person where I should be talking to them from like the inception of a project to say, hey, here's what I'm trying to achieve. How do I get there? And maybe forget about the visual. Maybe the visuals aren't even part of it. It's like how am I even thinking about this problem? I feel like that's why design's so interesting and hard to nail down
Yeah.
because it's like it could be anything.
Yeah, they really help with the tone of what you're trying to do. Like if you're doing like a website, like that content writing, like the copywriting in itself is also part of the design, like how you present the information. And if you don't get the designer to think about it and you're like, I want to just put an illustration first without really thinking about like how it all fits together, it might not end up being very good. Whereas the designer can think about everything holistically. It's like, yo, based on your limitations and like what illustrations you have or what assets you have, like then I can start to create like something based on the constraints that we're working with.
Great. Now let's jump back to some of the more traditional things people know about design or product design. So, like
Hmm.
visuals, UX research, maybe even like, user research. Like what are like the high level buckets you've seen or been involved with, whether they're part of formally a design team or not?
Everybody works together very closely. For UX research, it's like a take on academic research, but in like an office space or like with people. So academic in the sense that you're still using tools like surveys, but you might have like more modern tools like Usability Hub, usertesting.com. So like you have tools to help you, but the methodology and thinking of like the A/B testing, like testing against a p-value, that's still all the same in terms of academics. So the UX researcher works with the designer very closely. They're not the ones making the designs, but they're the ones to dictate, hey, like how can we change the design so we can test it better? That's UX research. The designer, it does specifically the mock-ups, the prototypes, the main things that you see. And maybe they'll even go in and do like further animations, like prototyping, to make it really feel like when you're doing user research, you are doing as if it was a real app, but it hadn't been coded. At Meta, we also have content designers, which focus more on the copywriting. They don't change the designs in terms of the visuals, but they highly influence what happens because they can give a lot of input on like what goes first, what goes second, and based on what text there is, the designer may have to change their designs as well. For example, if something is always a paragraph versus just a body header, then that starts looking kind of different in the whole layout.
That's awesome. Once again, it's kind of like I'll give you like a weird slash random example, which is I don't like many people, I don't have cable anymore, but I want to watch a Super Bowl. So I subscribed to Peacock. And I've been so once again, I've always heard like, companies like Netflix or like Airbnb, they excel at design, but
Mhm.
you can't explain it almost. But once again, no offense to Peacock, but I think they're like newer, so they haven't probably had much time or just years of experience like making their product. I felt like I couldn't do some basic things in Peacock, even though it's just like a video, streaming platform. It's like simple things like, wait a minute, why can't I look up the episodes? And it wasn't just like, oh, I'm used to doing this in this spot in Netflix. It's just like I don't even know where to click. It's like, wait a minute, like why can't I like skip 15 seconds, but I could do it another, there's so many things that it just feels weird, but you can't put a finger on it, which I think is like the mystery or allure of design. Because as you said, like if it works well, you don't even like when you don't even think about it. Like I'm just watching it. Like I don't even think about the Netflix app. I'm just watching my content. But for
Yeah.
experiences that I feel like are janky, now I'm like, wait a minute, why does this like button here? Why am I doing this? I'm thinking like that.
So that kind of goes back to why a design-driven company is so important. You have to start at the very beginning to have a good design. Because again, the that person is thinking about all this and how it's going to be in the future. But another part is like if you don't set some ground rules or like some system designs, then in the future it's going to be harder to build into. So an example is like, let's say you have a logo for your company, and then you decide, oh, I want to change this logo. First of all, you can't really do that. You can't just like reprint all your merchandise. You can't just like change your logo so suddenly. Every year, you have to maintain that for some time to at least hold your brand. But when it comes to like system design, once it's coded, it becomes harder and harder to change as you've built upon it. It's like Lego pieces. If your first Lego piece was like kind of jank, like let's just go with it. Yeah, it's gonna work. And you do that like 10 times. By the 20th time, you're like, those Lego pieces aren't gonna be as strong. Now it's hard to change. You can't just pull off the last one. So that's why like design focus, like long-term strategy, like not just MVP is really, really important here for any company.
Who are your key stakeholders? Let's say on a typical product team, is it a product manager? But you also have your like discipline, right? Your design manager. Like who helps, break ties, if a decision needs to be made? How does that work?
Based on my experience, it's really different between different companies. The first design job that I had, I was working at a consulting firm. It basically worked like an agency. So my stakeholder was the client. They had the entire say. Doesn't matter what anyone thinks. If they wanted it, then they were the main stakeholder. When I got to a mid-sized tech company at TrueCar, it was mixed, but it was very PM driven, product manager driven. They had a very large say. The developers definitely had a say, but it was a little bit more focused on like what are the limitations and whether or not they could do it. So like feasibility wise. And then when it came to design strategy, it was the creative director and also the VP of product. They had the largest say. For me on my current team at Meta, the engineers have a really big say on the product. So it's very engineer driven. PMs are there as well to kind of give feedback. They also have a lot of say as well. So at Meta, at least on my team, is very ground up, which is cool. I haven't had too much interaction with like the VP, so they don't have as much involvement. So very team dependent here.
The question I want to ask is how do you know when someone is good at the craft of product design? And I know the answer might be something along the lines of hey, when you're using the product, you're not even thinking about it. But what are some other signals I can get? Let's say, we didn't talk too much about, the visuals yet, but what makes a
Mhm.
visual good?
Yeah. So a lot of what I talked about is like assuming that you have like visual and UX stuff down. So definitely the number one thing that I look for when I'm looking at a designer is whether or not they can do visual work. The reason why that's important is because that's the thing that's hardest to learn. You can learn as much as you can in school, but it takes time to really train your eye to be sensitive to like the padding or like the motion or even like the font size. Like, can you look at a screen and be like, yeah, it's like 14 pixel font, or like, no, it's like 16. Like having that sensitivity will take a lot of time. So when I'm interviewing candidates, I make sure that they can do that because I can't teach them that, nor do I want to spend a lot of time to be like, it's like 12 pixels, but it really should be 14. Like to the untrained eye, like that makes no difference. But for a designer, you will be able to tell. So that's the number one thing that is to me is the most important and makes a good designer. They have to have this basic foundation. So padding is really important. Typography, like very basic graphic design skills, typography and the hierarchy. Hierarchy being like, does the text take up most of your attention or the image, or are they competing? Like making sure that the user is not thinking too much. They're chunking down the different parts so that when they look at it, they're like, oh, there's like this piece and then there's this piece. But as a designer, you have to make sure that the hierarchy works. Let's see, padding. Yeah, just like basic like color and typography. Not every color works together. Like if you were to make a style guide from scratch, not everybody will be able to do it. And then for typography, it's like, what fonts are you using? Like, do they match if you're using more than one? Typically now in product design, we don't do more than one anymore, but there's some places that they really do. And you have to be very careful about like pairing those. Yeah.
So
So that's the visual design.
that brings me, reminds me of like two story slash topics. The first one is a couple years ago. I don't know if you remember, but I was just like dabbling with like web design, just trying to get a little bit. I wouldn't even call it technical, but it's like HTML, right? And I could definitely, create things in HTML even today, like a page, a table, whatever. But the part that always kills me is the CSS, like the style sheet, because I feel like I could just never. Yes, I know how to do it, but the way it looks is so hard to make look right. And I try to copy so many
Hmm.
templates because the good thing about HTML is you can just copy templates or style sheets. But I think you could copy like HTML for like the different sections, but to copy a style sheet is really hard because it doesn't. It was made for some other purpose. So copying it, yeah, it might look like okay, but it might not serve your specific need.
And they did all the thinking for you too.
Yeah,
And exactly, it won't really fit your need all the time. It's hard because it's hard to learn because you're like, dude, what's the difference between 15 and 16? It's like literally one pixel difference
yeah.
of a font, but it makes a big difference when it starts to scale, like when you wrap. Not to even mention like the line height, like not just the font, like the
Mhm.
kerning and like all that. So it makes a big difference over time, but for the untrained eye, it's like you don't know why. You're not too sure. That's
And
why it takes a long time.
and that reminds me of the second story, which is I feel like a boomer now, but a lot of people like my generation looked up to like Steve Jobs. And the thing about him is like we could just look at the results, right? The products are just amazing. And I think I hope I got this right, but I think when he went to college, his like major was like design. And I think he told a story about like designing fonts and getting into stuff like kernels and like why he's so obsessed with it. And like I think especially maybe 30, 40 years ago, it wasn't as mainstream to know about these topics they were talking about, writing Medium articles. I don't think there was that much for the
Mhm.
web or technical product stuff, web 2 product stuff. Yeah, just fascinating that like some of our kind of most creative leaders, we kind of they really highlight their design background. Like I think Steve Jobs was like the best example, but more recently, Brian Chesky from Airbnb, which is interesting because now that you talk about it, I kept thinking about Airbnb and design. I'm like, oh, like the website works just fine, but now that you talked about it, and I heard a recent interview from him, yes, the website's fine, but like the Airbnb experience is designed well.
Mhm.
That requires design. That's probably potentially even more important than the website. The website is just like the final manifestation, but like if you have a terrible experience, who cares what the website looks like? So my question to you is, even though I just mentioned two kind of popular folks with like design backgrounds who've made it to like CEO or like a powerful position, there still just isn't like a lot. I can't name like 10, 20, 30 names. Are there some other people you know of, or why do you think design isn't quote unquote like there's not that many designers in the C-suite? Is it because it's hard to like put your nail, your thumb on it or something?
I want to answer this question by also answering another question before that, which was
Sure.
like, what makes really good product design? So on top of the visual, and this is something that like I think not a lot of people realize is it's actually very calculated, and that's what kind of makes a good design. So the numbers that people choose are not random. Like the fonts that people use, like the scaling, the hierarchy, there's something called like a golden ratio for these fonts. And as you increase the font size, it does not increase by like a set, what's the word? Like linearly. It goes by the golden ratio. So like it goes like much larger every time you get
I
larger.
see.
There's that. When you're designing for web or mobile, there's something called like a grid, a responsive grid. And then as you scale down, like it all measures out perfectly. You have like 12 column grids or like 8 column grids. You have like all the padding in between exactly the same. And no one can see this but the designer because they were using this grid to do this all the time. And then I think Google Material was like the first people to really write this down. And I use it as like my Bible now, but they were really, really strict about their padding. So they went by an 8 point baseline grid, which meant that every value that you had, every button, every padding has to go by a multiplier of 8. So if you look at their buttons, it's like 30, it's like 36 pixel height. Or sorry, it was like 32. Yeah, like 32 pixel height. And it has to be like 56 pixels wide. And then the pattern between that and the next element is also divisible by 8. It's gonna be like 16 pixels or something. So it's like crazy when you realize this, that everything has been calculated in some way. The padding, like the height, like, and then all that when you put it together, you're like, oh, it just looks really nice. And as a non-trained designer, you're not gonna know why, but everything had been calculated at some point. And to kind of put that into like the whole CEO conversation, it's hard to master so many things at once. I think being a really good speaker, being very business savvy is of course like its own job in itself. So to have both the skills like a designer and like a business person is it's gonna be pretty rare. If you can put it together, it's great, but I don't think like even myself, like I don't be able to start a company. That's like I'm too far away from that. And it's not quite my aspirations at this moment. So yeah, and then if you were to start a business first and then you wanted to learn designs, well then that's again just really hard, right? Because it takes years to kind of have that focus and that understanding.
Well, that brings me to my next question, which is product design seems to be it's like an art and a craft. It seems to be hard to master. How does one even get into it? Is there such a thing as like entry level product designer? I'll give you an example. So I think historically most product managers at certain companies were like former engineers or they're like program managers or they had some tech skills and then they just kind of graduated or became a product manager. And then certain companies like Meta, they have like a product management boot camp. And I think I think if since it's a boot camp, you can have like fresh college grads, but sometimes people will have like 2 years of experience in a different function, like marketing or whatever, right? So tell us more about product design. Is there like what's the entry level path look like, if any, or do you need a couple of years in like a different role, like UX researcher or
Mhm.
content designer, and then you become a product designer?
Yeah, I get this question a lot, and it depends on what stage of life you're in. If you're in college and there's some kind of major for product design, go for it. When I was in college, this was not an option. So, but I think now if you're in a college that has that, I would go for that. If they don't, the second best option if you're stuck still in college is by far graphic design. I would even argue to a small degree that it might be better than product design if you had two choices. Because like I said, it takes a long time to train that eye for graphic design. And is again the basis of product design. Still very different, but it will help you extremely well and get you past more than most people. If you've graduated with a degree not in design and you're really just starting out, you're like, I just want to just try this. You can either go through the bootcamp way where you'll learn everything in a couple months. You're not going to be able to train your eye as fast. So you have to do a lot of work on top of that. I think it's like a great starting point, to be honest. It really teaches you the thinking methodology. Just know that like not everything that they teach is what you actually use in day to day. But I've had a lot of people tell me success stories from going to that. So I think for now it's like pretty good. If you want to save yourself money and you're really, really diligent, you can just self-learn. I think there's a lot of great resources out there nowadays where you can just self-learn everything, try to pay attention yourself to like how things are scaling or just looking at websites. I use a lot of Chrome extensions to kind of just be like, oh, I like that font. Like, what is that? And you can just like tap on it and it'll tell you. Or you'd be like, dude, this site looks really good, but I don't know why. And I'll go inspect like the font size, like the leading, and it's always going to be different. But over time, like I personally just I read so many articles on Medium. I looked at so many websites. I just spent so much time by myself, like really, really trying to like learn. So there's a lot of different avenues. The first actual design job is going to be the hardest to find. I myself spent 6 months unemployed, like looking for a design job. But after that, I learned so much on the job, and I got to kind of grow my career that way.
Okay, final question for me, which is related to what you just said, which is based on this conversation, I have increased my respect for designers so much that I feel like, hey, what can I do to just like train my eye a little bit, right? Maybe I can't do the work, but how do I even start to notice these things? What are some things I can do or people can do when they're like, mid career or late career? Is it as you said, like read articles online? The internet's awesome, right? Watch YouTube videos. Like that's more of like a passive like intake kind of like are there anything else I can do? For example, if I want to learn more about what engineers do, I could, learn HTML. It's kind of easy, or I
Hmm.
learn JavaScript. Is it like learn material design? Like what are some more like hands-on things someone mid-career can do to just like train their eye and like get a sense of things?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think if you want to, like the articles are good for learning UX, like why someone did the things that they did. The visual part, I actually really, really like and recommend Google Materials Style Guide. They do a great job at explaining why they made the decisions, but also like do's and don'ts of like their guide. They also highlight exactly what the pixels are for each padding space. And they just do such a good job of explaining exactly why. So that's where I learned a lot of my design, open source, free, like out there. They update it very regularly, and you see how things build into each other. Like you use an icon, you put it in a circle. Now this is like a component. You put the component in like an input field, and now this is like an input field. Now you put the input field in like a form. Okay, now you have like a form. So like all these things build upon each other. If you want something even more hands-on, like this is asking for a lot, but I think it's going to be really good. Like take your favorite website. Let's say it's Airbnb. Open your favorite design tool, like for me it's Figma, and just try to copy as much as you can what the site looks. And you're going to be really off, but then just keep comparing like back and forth until you get it like pixel perfect. I think that's a really good way to learn the difference of like what you think it looks like and what it actually is. And then like comparing it back and forth and be like, oh, like that's why it looks good because this text was super, super small or something like that.
No, that's awesome. And I think kind of meta to this whole conversation about craft is that I think, to at least for me and some other people, the best way to learn is to teach because you need to be able to
Hmm.
explain it like 5x or 10x better, when you're trying to like educate someone, like our audience or me. So it's cool that you read all these articles and other things online, and then I know you ended up writing a lot of them too. And I think that's awesome because you're kind of like paying it forward. And
Yeah.
also just like, you read some good material, but like material needs to be updated, right? And then maybe someone reads your articles in 2 years, they become like a full-time product designer, and now they're writing their thoughts because it's like an evolving field. Like you were just saying, even when you graduated from college, there was no product design major, and most schools probably didn't have that. But now I've seen a couple more that start to have it. I mean, even most schools
Hmm.
don't have product management as a degree either. So I think what's interesting is that like you're not like for the audience, like you're not. It's not too late. A lot of this is evolving. It's new, and I think it's these are just good career paths. So
Yeah, it's constantly changing. Like the standards or like what looks good is always changing. Like now in the recent years, rounded corners is like a big thing. And they're going like even rounder every time, like every year, to the point where I'm like, oh, it's like getting a little bit too crazy. But like the trends change. Before it's like skeuomorphism, like which is what Matt or Apple was doing where, like things like a button are a little bit like off the ground, like elevated with a shadow. And then Google made it all like flat and depressed, not like depressed, but like flat. And that was like a trend. And now we're kind of like somewhere in between with like a lot of shadows and gradients. So it's always changing. Even the tools are changing. When I first started, I was using Actor and I went to Sketch. And I started at Meta. I'm using Figma now. So everything is always changing. And yeah, definitely. It's never too late to learn.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time today. Looking forward to catching up in the future.
Awesome. Thanks so much, John.